In this video, I'm going to do the trigonometry example sheet. This is going to also be uploaded so that you can just look at all these problems worked out. I'm going to do the first two from each section, and then you can go through and look at the other ones worked out later. So in section 1, it says find the value of each trigonometric ratio. So we are looking at tangent. And we are going to look at what we are looking for each of these. So we are doing tangent, which means I need opposite and adjacent. I'm looking at C. So I always start by labeling the hypotenuse, because we know that is the same for everything. Now from C, I put a dot at C and a dot at B. In between those, I have the adjacent. Across from C, or in this case, the only one that's left is the opposite. Tangent, I need opposite and adjacent, so I'm going to mark out the hypotenuse, don't need to use it. I write tangent of C is equal to opposite, 15, on top of adjacent, 36, and this fraction is actually my answer for these first problems, so that's all we're looking for. This is exactly like the IXL from last week. Let's go ahead and look at 2. We are doing cosine this time, so we know we're going to need adjacent hypotenuse. And I highly recommend, if you're doing stuff like this, writing on a sticky note and just using it over and over again. Super easy. So we are looking at A. But the first thing I want to do is label that hypotenuse. Once again, that's the same every time, so it's super duper easy. Put a dot at A, put a dot at the right angle. In between them is the adjacent. Across from A is the opposite. And whichever you think is easiest, adjacent or opposite, is what you should label, because you don't have to know both. Once you know one, you know the other. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so I'm going to mark out opposite, don't need that. Cosine of A is equal to adjacent on top of hypotenuse, 21 on top of 29. That fraction is my answer. Like I said, I'm going to do these last two, but I will upload that. Section 2, find the missing side. So this is actually using the trigonometric functions to figure something out. So what I'm doing is I am going to find x. X is the hypotenuse here. And let's go ahead and figure out what everything else is. The angle they gave me is 19, which is this angle. So I know that that is the angle I am going to be working with. When I put in the number for the angle, it will be 19. I need to figure out which trigonometric function they gave me the information for. So I'm going to go to 19. In between 19 and the right angle is the adjacent. Across from that is the opposite. Opposite has a 10, hypotenuse has an x. There isn't anything over here with A, so that's the side I'm not going to use. So now I have to decide which one of these I can use. I can use the one that has opposite and hypotenuse. That is sine, opposite, and hypotenuse. So I'll write sine of the number of degrees is equal to the opposite on top of the hypotenuse. And now I'm going to have to solve for x. And to do that, we are going to do a little algebra. So I'm going to use cross multiplication because I think it's the easiest way to do this. So I'm going to put this on top of 1 because we know anything can be put on top of 1. And then I'm going to cross multiply. So 10 times 1 is 10. Sine of 19 times x is x times sine of 19. Once this goes together, it is one number, and it stays together until we put it in the calculator. That means that I can't just divide by 19, I have to divide by this whole thing. It's going to be a decimal like you saw last week when you were learning how to use the calculator. So I don't want to simplify it yet because then I got to write this weird decimal down the whole time. And this is easier. So now I get x equals 10 over sine of 19, and this is where we're going to want to use the calculator, so I'm going to pull that up. So what we had was 10 on top of sine of 19. So like I said, we just plug that straight in the calculator, and here is our answer. So x is equal to 30.7. And 30.7 is this side. So now we know the length of that side. We're going to do number 6 on the video as well. So in number 6, I'm going to start by labeling the hypotenuse. Then I look for the angle that has a number of degrees. That would be this one over here. So I'm going to put a dot at both of these. In between the two dots is the adjacent. Across from 61 is going to be the opposite. I go through and mark out the one that doesn't have something. So 15 goes with A, X goes with O, H does not have something. I'm looking for the one that has opposite and adjacent. That is tangent. So now I'm going to do tangent of the number of degrees is equal to opposite on top of adjacent. Opposite was X. Adjacent is 15. We're going to do that cross multiplication, so I put imaginary 1 underneath here. 1 times X is X. 15 times tangent of 61 is that, because I can't multiply. So 15 goes on the outside. Tangent of 61 goes on the inside. Think of this like we did square roots. Whatever's inside stays inside. Whatever's outside stays outside. When I put it in the calculator, it can simplify it, but this is as good as I get without the calculator. So let's go ahead and put that in the calculator, and we'll be finished with this. So we have 15 tangent of 61. So x is equal to 27.1 because I'm rounding to the 10th. So I'm going to say it's 27 1/10 because 6 rounds up. And that is the length of this side. Like I said, I will work the other two out and leave them for you, but I'm going to move on to section 3, where we are going to talk about how to do an inverse trig function. This is way easier than what we just did. It's just learning to use the calculator, kind of like you did last week with one that you're using the calculator. The difference here is we're finding the angle before you were finding the side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do what's called the inverse. You may remember the inverse of, you may remember this from 8th grade. This turned out to be 1 over x. This was called an inverse anytime I have a -1 exponent. So basically what it is if you multiply something by its inverse, it will become 1. So I change this to this. Now I can multiply x over x. If I have the same thing on top and bottom, they cancel out, giving me 1. So when I multiply something by the inverse, it cancels out. So what I'm going to do is do the inverse of this. What I do to one side, I have to do to the other. And I'm writing it all the way out right now. You never have to do this. I just want you to understand what's happening. Sine inverse and sine cancel out. So you just get u equals this, and that's all you have to plug in the calculator. So we're going to do sine inverse. To do that, we're going to click the functions, and you get sine -1. Sorry. And then we're going to put 0.891. So that degree, that angle is 62.99, so that actually rounds up to 63 degrees. And once again, when I do an inverse, I'm finding the angle. So I'm going to make sure I put that it's in degrees. And like I said, you don't always have to write this out. You're actually going to probably skip that every single time. That was just to explain it. So I know that if I have cosine u, to find u, I do the inverse. So all you need to write is this. Once I know this, they cancel out on either side. I just plug it straight into the calculator. And once again, to plug that in the calculator, what you need to press is this function button, and then you get the inverses. So cosine 0.2419, and that is 76 degrees. And all I had to do was utilize the calculator to do these. Now, number 10 on your worksheet is something is equal to 0. Please make sure you plug that in the calculator, because just because it's 0 doesn't mean the answer is going to be 0. Section 4. It looks like I may have to make section 5 a separate video. Find the measure of the indicated angle to the nearest degree. So this is what we just did, except for now we're pulling it off the triangle. So we're going to go back and do the same thing that we did in section 2 by labeling all my pieces. Across from the right angle, we have the hypotenuse. This is the angle in question this time, so I'm going to put a dot there, dot at the right angle, in between is the adjacent. Side across, or the side left over, is the opposite. Mark out the one that doesn't have anything. Both of these have numbers. Opposite doesn't have anything. And then use that to determine what we're using. So we've got adjacent hypotenuse. Adjacent hypotenuse tells me cosine. So cosine. And we have a question mark here, so I'm going to make that into a variable and just call it x. I'm choosing x because I know most of us like x. You can use whatever letter you want. And then cosine is adjacent on top of hypotenuse. So that is 24 on top of 44. We could simplify this, but we're using a calculator, so you really don't have to. So remember, to get the angle, we do the inverse just like we did in those previous ones. So I'm going to get x equals cosine inverse. And now I just have to type this into the calculator. A lot of people think the inverse is harder. I think it's easier because we're pretty much doing the same thing over and over again. And you don't really have to do too much. So I'm typing that in. And there is the length of our angle. 56.94 degrees. And I rounded to the 100th place. The paper actually says round to the nearest degree, so that means that we need to round to a whole number, right? So let's cross that out. And since it said that, we're rounding to 57. Okay. Number 14 is going to be the... Actually, I'm running out of time on this one, so I'll do number 14 with section 5 in the next video.